Unions are very important institutions to try and understand, certainly in terms of the employment relationship, where they're considered as one of the central actors within that relationship, but also in terms of rewards. Rewards represent the key concern of labour within the employment relationship. They represent the key issue that employees are focused around. It's the key cause of conflict. And so the way in which unions are oriented around rewards and pay is quite natural and needs to be understood in order to place that within context, to make sense of what it is that unions want, how they operate in relation to rewards, and what their priorities are. So we need to spend a little bit of time just familiarising ourselves with these as organisations to understand what they are, where they come from, how they think, and what they're influenced by. And so we're going to begin that process here. Now, as we've mentioned earlier, unions represent the development of a long desire that we've seen historically for employees to attempt to shift the balance of advantage, the balance of power within labour markets. And this usually takes on some kind of institutional form. Sometimes that balance of advantage is moved because of regulation or legislation, like a minimum wage or a living wage or whatever we might want to call it. Sometimes it happens because of market forces, but sometimes it's simply about trying to increase your power within the bargaining relationship, to increase your power, your weight within the labour market. Because individually as employees, unless you're spectacularly unique and valuable, most of the time you can't exercise much influence to move the labour market in your favour, simply because there are too many employees in that situation, too many interactions, too many possibilities for buyers to go elsewhere. So unions represent one of those organisations, similar to guilds, that we've seen develop within labour markets over the centuries in order to exercise more power, more advantage on the seller's side of the labour market as against the buyer's side of the labour market. So we can see them as part of that tradition. Now, of course, the kinds of modern trade unions that we see now, some of which have multi-millions strong in terms of membership, which operate across industries, across occupations, and with some beginnings of international joint ventures between unions in order to compete effectively in a global labour market. To some extent, they're a very far cry from those early medieval guilds, but they do represent, as we've said earlier, a similar kind of intention. So what can we know about unions? How can we make sense of the way in which they behave and how they operate in a modern context? So if we take it back to kind of bare bones, and we think about the way in which McElroy talked about unions and what they're for and what they do. He identifies a number of key features. Firstly, that unions came into being as a response to capitalism. So they are a symptom of our economic system. And we've talked about this implicitly before now, that we see that they act in order to provide a different kind of balance that wouldn't otherwise be there in labour markets. So they're a symptom of that market situation that capitalism as an economic situation implies. So they're not just standalone things, they didn't just pop into existence, they came into being as a response to a set of economic conditions. So we need to ground our understanding of what they are and what they're for within those economic conditions. Part of those fundamental economic conditions, as McElroy goes on to talk about, are that for the majority of people, all that we have that's of any value is our labour. And so in order to live, in order to survive, or have any reasonable standard of living in a modern economy, the majority of people are compelled to sell their labour power. That is all that we have that is of value. That's all that we have to sell. And that as part of that process, as part of that dynamic of selling our labour power, there is an imbalance, that the market isn't perfect, that one side of the labour market has more power than the other. And so unions exist in order to redress that balance. And the way in which they redress that balance is to try to overcome the individual weakness of employees within the labour market with collective strength. So collectivism and the desire to replace individual bargaining between employees and their employers with a collective unit is absolutely central to the raison d'etre of trade unions. That unions have to have this collective orientation. Unionism implies collective bargaining, where employees are grouped together into units, and that collective strength, their ability to remove their labour, to strike, to disrupt the productive processes, all of these things represent a potential source of power for unions against what we already know as the implicit strength of employers in the labour market. So collectivism and unions go hand in hand. So to understand the way that unions behave means that we need to appreciate that collectivism is at the very heart of what they do. Now, how that is expressed obviously changes depending on union, depending on personalities, depending on circumstances, depending on industry, organisation, values, ideology, economic circumstances, all kinds of things. So what kinds of influences might we see which alter the ways in which unions might behave from time to time? The first thing, very clearly, is the economic context. We keep coming back to this. Product markets lie at the heart of virtually all of these issues that we're concerned with. They're the floor upon which everything else rests, the base that Marx might have referred to it as. So the economic context in which unions operate has a major influence on how they might behave. So what are the income trends within a particular labour market or within a particular economy? Are people doing very well, or are people suffering? Are living standards increasing, or are they decreasing? The answers to these questions will then start to indicate the kinds of orientations that unions might take towards that economy or towards that labour market. Do they feel the need to be more militant, or is the situation broadly okay and they can take a more moderate line, that there isn't a huge problem to be solved? It's important to remember, unions are not revolutionary organisations. Unions are institutions which seek to reform situations, to move the balance of advantage in one way rather than another, not rip up the basis of the economic system. So they're very pragmatic, and so you will tend to see a greater degree of industrial peace in certain economic situations than you will in others. Similarly big and important contextual issue is the socio-political context. What are the systems of labour regulation within which an employment relationship operates? Are there many rules? Are there many safeguards? Are there many mechanisms and institutions which already protect the interests of employees, or is regulation very light? The frameworks within which unions operate and the rules within which they negotiate have a major influence on the ways in which they will seek to behave. So you will see across economies, in a developing nation, perhaps with autocratic government, with limited labour regulation and so on, that unions will take on a very different flavour of approach than they will in a very heavily regulated, established economy with systems of representation, sometimes systems of input into economic policy and so on, where they're implicit within the operation of the nation state and the workings of the economy, that they have a role. Unions will necessarily behave differently in one context rather than another. So the power dynamics in society have an impact upon how unions behave. The extent to which they are supported by the institutions of the state will have an impact upon unions. The extent to which the government of the day is broadly favourable or in opposition to unions will have an impact upon how unions behave. Their broad levels of popularity within the population will have an impact upon how unions behave. And so this is another important set of variables that we need to make sense of in order to properly understand the ways in which unions are behaving and how they might behave in other given situations. Two further levels of context that we might want to take into account. Firstly, the employer context, the extent to which employers' ideology is sympathetic to unions. This is similar to the orientation of government to unions, but this time at the level of institutions, at the level of the organisation itself. To what extent do employers feel sympathetic towards unions? To what extent are they seen as partners, or are they seen as outsiders? To what extent are they being set up as opposition to the organisation and what management want to achieve? And similarly, in the way in which economic context broadly provides a canvas on which union activity can be understood, the economic performance of an individual company will alter the behaviour of unions and the interactions between unions and the organisation. So where an organisation is struggling more, we'll tend to see more opposition, more defensiveness on the part of management, and often a response on the part of the union itself. The final level of context is the worker context. Unions are at base an organisation of workers. Now, of course, they have bureaucracies and structures which create their own dynamics, but at base they respond to the level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction amongst the workforce. They can't generate conflict where conflict doesn't exist, or at least not successfully so for any period of time. And there is little to suggest that is a common feature of union activity anyway. So at bottom, the basis of how unions behave will be to reflect and to express the level of dissatisfaction within the workforce. Now, we've seen these various influences result in patterns of behaviour across and between unions over long periods of time. Over the past 30 years at least, unions have been in a general period of decline, having grown very substantially throughout much of the 20th century. In many Western economies, particularly as key manufacturing industries have offshored and moved along with the tides of global economic development, many of the existing strongholds of union organisation have disappeared from the mature developed economies. And so many Western trade unions have been in a period of crisis and have been attempted to renew themselves, to find new sources of support, new sources of membership, new sources of legitimacy. And we've seen this take on a variety of different forms. But three broad approaches have tended to stand out. On the one hand, we've seen unions attempting to establish their legitimacy by appealing to organisations to identify themselves as being important productivity partners with organisations. That because unions have an inbuilt legitimacy with the workforce, which management often struggles to achieve themselves, that striking productivity agreements and other kinds of workplace reforms hand in hand with unions will have more effectiveness than it would if management were to go it alone. And this so-called partnership approach to unionism has been a feature of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Not always terribly successfully, either from the point of view of the unions themselves, who often didn't get the membership gains that they might have expected, nor indeed from their members, who didn't often share in the benefits of partnership arrangements. And these were often seen to be best all round for employers rather than anybody else within the employment relationship. Another approach to unionism that we've seen as a common approach towards renewal over this period is so-called social movement unionism. And this is about building out from the traditional basis of membership in the union movement, out from the workplaces into communities to find new sources of influence, new sources of activism, new sources of mobilization, to fight campaigns around social justice issues, to establish the legitimacy as a social partner within the community. The final approach that we've seen unions adopt is almost the polar opposite to partnership unionism, and this is so-called organising unionism. And this is where unions attempt to find their way back to their initial source of support, to build a new, vibrant, campaigning, workplace-based identity, where they fight on issues, organise from a basis of collective strength, and take on employers in a more traditional, militant way. Now, again, this often requires unions to reorient their approaches, to resource areas of activity that have often become moribund, and is very difficult to achieve. One thing that can be very clearly said, whatever these three forms or three broad strategies towards renewal, is that whatever unions have attempted to do, without the right kind of contextual situations being present, it's unlikely that unions are going to see a substantial growth in either membership or influence.